The polyester graduation gown clung to my skin in the humid Tennessee morning, and the cardboard mortarboard kept sliding forward no matter how many times I adjusted the elastic band digging into my skull. I stood at the corner of Hillsborough Pike and 21st Avenue, watching the number 17 bus crawl through downtown traffic, and tried to ignore the celebration happening less than half a block away in the driveway I had walked out of just minutes before. My name is Daisy Parker, and I was 23 years old on the morning that should have been one of the proudest days of my life. Except nobody in my family seemed to remember I was graduating from college at all. The bus stop smelled like hot asphalt and someone's discarded fast food breakfast, and I clutched my rolled-up diploma case like it was the only proof I existed. Because in that moment, it felt like the only thing tethering me to reality. Down the street, my mother Lydia was sobbing with joy, her arms wrapped around my younger sister Amber, who was 18 and had just finished her senior year of high school the week before. My father Charles stood beside them both, his chest puffed out like a peacock, one hand resting on the hood of the brand new pearl-white Tesla Model S they had just presented to Amber, with a giant crimson bow stuck to the windshield. The chrome door handles caught the sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes that hurt my eyes even from this distance, and I watched my mother dab at her tears with a monogrammed handkerchief while she told Amber that she deserved the world, that she was their precious baby girl, that nothing was too good for someone so special. My father announced to the empty street that this was the safest vehicle on the road, that only the best would do for his princess, and Amber squealed and jumped up and down in her designer sundress, her hair bouncing in perfect waves that had probably taken an hour with a curling iron to achieve. Nobody glanced toward the bus stop where I stood in my wrinkled graduation gown that I'd rented because buying one seemed like an unnecessary expense I could not afford. Nobody asked how I was getting to my own graduation ceremony. Nobody seemed to notice or care that I was leaving at all. The bus wheezed to a stop in front of me with a hydraulic sigh that sounded tired and defeated, and the accordion doors folded open to reveal a driver who looked like he had been awake for 36 hours straight and had stopped caring about anything around hour 12. I climbed the ribbed metal steps, fed a crumpled dollar bill and some change into the fare box, and found a seat near a window that was covered in a film of grime and finger smudges. The vinyl seat was sticky against the back of my thighs, and someone had carved the words, quote, 0, into the plastic seat back in front of me, with what looked like a house key. As the bus lurched away from the curb with a grinding sound that suggested the transmission was on its last legs, I turned to look back one final time at the scene I was leaving behind. My family was still clustered around the Tesla, taking photographs with their phones held at arm's length, tilting their heads together and smiling those practiced smiles that people use when they are performing happiness for social media. My mother had her arm around Amber's shoulders. My father was pointing at something on the car's touchscreen display. None of them looked up. None of them saw me go. The bus picked up speed and carried me away from them, and I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the dirty window and watched my childhood home shrink into the distance, until it was just another house on just another tree-lined street in just another affluent Nashville neighborhood, where families were supposed to love all their children equally. The ride to Vanderbilt's campus took 47 minutes through morning traffic, and I spent every one of those minutes staring at my reflection in the window glass, watching my face superimposed over the passing cityscape, and making a promise to myself that was so cold and clear it felt like swallowing ice water. I promised that this invisibility would end, that their favoritism would no longer define who I was or what I could become, that I would build something so undeniable that they would have to see me whether they wanted to or not. I imagined them years from now, driving past billboards with my name on them, seeing my face in newspapers, hearing people talk about my success in rooms where they had once dismissed me as the quiet one who kept to herself and never caused any trouble. The promise was not loud or dramatic, not the kind of vow that comes with shouting or tears or slammed doors. It was something quieter and more dangerous, a seed of determination that planted itself deep in my chest where the hurt lived. And I knew even then that it would grow into something they never saw coming. Growing up in the Parker household had been like living in a museum dedicated entirely to my sister's existence, where every wall was a gallery of her achievements and every conversation was a celebration of her potential. Our house was a sprawling colonial in one of Nashville's nicest neighborhoods, the kind of place with black shutters and a wide front porch where my mother and Amber would sit together on summer evenings, sharing secrets and laughing, while I did my homework alone in my room upstairs. Inside, the walls were covered with framed photographs that told the story of Amber's life in excruciating detail, starting with her first steps as a chubby toddler and continuing through every milestone that followed. There were pictures of her gap-toothed grin at age 6, her starring role in the middle school musical, her homecoming court tiara glittering under gymnasium lights, her volleyball uniform muddy after a championship game. My father had commissioned a professional portrait of her on horseback, wearing English riding gear that had cost more than my textbooks for an entire semester, and that portrait hung above the fireplace in a gilded frame that probably required its own insurance policy. The single photograph of me in the entire downstairs was a small 5x7 frame tucked behind a crystal vase on the mantel, showing a 7-year-old girl in a plain yellow dress, standing slightly off to the side, looking at the camera with an expression that even then suggested she knew she was an afterthought. My father, Charles Parker, measured everything in his life by return on investment, which made sense given that he had built his fortune developing commercial real estate across 3 counties. He saw Amber as prime waterfront property with unlimited appreciation potential, the kind of asset you pour money into because you know it will pay dividends for years to come. She was beautiful in that effortless way that people notice, with honey blonde hair and green eyes and a smile that could charm anyone from bank tellers to college admissions officers. He invested in her accordingly, paying for private tennis lessons and dance classes, and a wardrobe full of clothes from stores I had only ever walked past while window shopping. When he came home from work each evening, his first question was always the same, called out in a booming voice before he had even put down his briefcase. He would ask where his princess was, and Amber would come running from wherever she had been, and he would scoop her up even when she got too big to really scoop, and they would talk about her day while I set the table for dinner and try to pretend I did not care. I, on the other hand, was reliable and low-maintenance property, the kind of investment that does not require much attention because it will probably be fine on its own. My father saw my independence not as strength, but as proof that I did not need anything from him, and he responded by giving me exactly that, which was nothing at all. I remember the dinner when I was 15 years old and had just been accepted into a prestigious summer science program at Vanderbilt University, a program that only took 30 students from across the entire state and would have looked incredible on college applications. I had waited for the right moment to make my announcement, practicing the words in my head while we ate pot roast and mashed potatoes. And when there was finally a pause in the conversation, I took a breath and told them I had gotten into the Vanderbilt program. My father looked up from his plate, chewing slowly, and nodded once before saying, "That was good. That science programs looked solid on college applications. Very practical." Then he turned to Amber without missing a beat and asked her to tell him more about the theme for the upcoming spring formal dance, because he and my mother had been thinking she needed a new dress for such an important occasion. The conversation shifted like water flowing around a stone, and my news was left behind, forgotten before the next bite of food was taken. My mother Lydia dealt in emotional currency, and she spent every penny she had on Amber, managing my sister's social calendar with the intensity of a Fortune 500 executive, and serving as her confidant and therapist and stylist and best friend, all rolled into one exhausting package. Their relationship was a fortress with walls so high I could never see over them, and every time I tried to find a door or a window or even a crack to slip through, I was gently but firmly redirected back to the outside, where I apparently belonged. The bus made another stop, and an elderly woman got on, moving slowly with a cane, and I stood up automatically to offer her my seat, because that was the kind of thing I had learned to do when nobody was watching. The small kindnesses that nobody noticed or rewarded. She thanked me with a smile that showed missing teeth, and I moved to stand near the back door, holding onto a grimy pole and swaying with the motion of the bus as it carried me toward a future that I was building entirely on my own. Around me were the faces of strangers, people heading to work or appointments or wherever Saturday mornings took them, and I realised that these strangers had more reality to them than my own family did. Because at least these people existed in the same world I did, while my parents and sister seemed to occupy some parallel universe where I was just a background extra in someone else's story. The bus crossed the bridge over the Cumberland River, and I watched the water below, brown and sluggish in the summer heat, and thought about how water always finds its way forward, no matter what obstacles block its path. It goes around, goes under, wears away stone over time with nothing but patience and persistence. I would be like that water, I decided, and one day they would look up and realise I had carved out canyons while they were busy taking selfies with a car that would be worthless in 5 years. The bus finally pulled up to the campus, just as I was starting to worry I would be late, and I stepped down onto the sidewalk and joined the stream of other graduates and their families, heading toward the stadium where the ceremony would be held. All around me were parents carrying cameras and grandparents moving slowly in their Sunday best, siblings holding balloons and flowers, everyone dressed up and smiling and proud. I walked alone through the crowd, my cheap rented gown already making me sweat in the climbing heat, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Something cold and hard crystallizing into a shape I did not yet fully understand. This was not sadness anymore, not the soft grief of being overlooked that I'd carried with me since childhood. This was something sharper, something that had edges and weight, something that would cut anyone who tried to dismiss me again. I found my place in the alphabetical line of graduates, somewhere between a girl named Amanda Papadopoulos and a guy named Marcus Patterson. And we smiled at each other with the nervous excitement of people about to walk across a stage and receive a piece of paper that supposedly proved we were ready for the rest of our lives. The stadium speakers crackled to life and someone began playing processional music, and we started walking, a river of black gowns flowing toward an uncertain future. And I thought about how none of my family would see this moment, how they would not watch me walk across that stage or hear my name called, or know what it had cost me to get here. And then I thought about something else, something that made a cold smile spread across my face as I walked. What I did not know that morning, standing in line waiting to graduate, was that this moment of being unseen would be the last time they could ignore me, because I was about to build something that would make it impossible for them to look away ever again. The memories of childhood flooded back as I sat in that stadium waiting for my name to be called. And I remembered with perfect clarity the Christmas morning when I was 13 years old and learned exactly how much less I mattered than my sister. We had woken before dawn the way children do on Christmas, and Amber had raced downstairs in her matching pyjama set that my mother had special ordered from some boutique catalogue, while I followed behind in the old flannel pants and t-shirt I had been sleeping in for 3 years. The living room was transformed into something from a department store window display, with a massive tree that touched the ceiling, and presents stacked so high around its base that you could barely see the floor. My father had been up since 5 in the morning, he told us later, arranging everything just perfectly for his princess. And when Amber started opening gifts, it became immediately clear that this Christmas was a production with only one star. She unwrapped box after box of designer clothes and expensive electronics and jewellery that sparkled under the tree lights, squealing with delight at each new treasure, while my mother captured every moment on video and my father beamed with the satisfaction of someone who knows he has spent his money well. Then came the finale, the gift that my father had been building up to all morning, and he led Amber to the window and told her to look outside at the front yard. In the driveway, illuminated by strings of white lights my father must have hung in the dark, stood a real Shetland pony with a red velvet bow tied around its neck, and Amber screamed so loud I thought the windows might shatter. My mother started crying those happy tears that seemed to come so easily when it came to my sister. And my father explained that he had arranged for the pony to be boarded at a stable just outside the city, that Amber could visit it whenever she wanted, that this was just the beginning of what he could provide for someone so deserving. They spent the next 2 hours taking pictures with the pony while it stood patiently in the cold, breathing clouds of steam into the winter air. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I opened my own presents, which consisted of a complete set of encyclopedias and a new desk lamp. My father told me that these gifts would help me keep up those good grades, that education was an investment in my future, and he said it with genuine approval in his voice, like he believed he was being generous. The gifts were not cruel, not intentionally, but they were functional in a way that made it clear what my purpose was in this family. Amber was meant to be celebrated and delighted and showered with things that brought joy, while I was meant to be studious and self-sufficient and grateful for tools that would help me require even less attention than I already did. The science fair in 8th grade became another defining moment that I would carry with me for years. One of those experiences that teaches you exactly where you stand in someone's hierarchy of importance. I had spent 3 solid months working on my project in the garage, building a solar-powered water desalination system from scratch, teaching myself physics and chemistry from textbooks I had checked out from the library, burning my fingers on soldering irons, and staying up until midnight calibrating pressure valves and testing filtration rates. The project consumed every spare moment I had, and when I finally finished it, I felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost frightening, because I knew I had created something genuinely impressive, something that actually worked. The state science fair was held in a convention center in Memphis, and when they called my name for first place, I walked to the stage with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And I accepted the trophy that was nearly as tall as I was, and thought that surely this would be the thing that made my parents see me. I took the bus home because they had not come to the fair. They had explained apologetically that they could not miss Amber's play rehearsal, and I walked through the front door carrying my giant first-place trophy and found them in the living room, helping my sister memorize lines for some production I could not even remember the name of now. I stood in the doorway holding my trophy and waited for them to notice me, and when my mother finally glanced up, she smiled vaguely and asked if I had a nice time at my little science thing. I told her I had won first place in the state, that there had been over 200 projects competing, that the judges had called my work remarkably sophisticated for someone my age. My father looked up from the script he was holding and said that was wonderful, that he was not surprised because I had always been good at school. And then he turned back to Amber and told her she needed to really sell the emotion in the next scene, that she had to make the audience believe she meant every word. The moment lasted maybe 30 seconds, and then I was dismissed, my achievement acknowledged and immediately forgotten, and I carried my trophy upstairs to my room, where it would sit on a shelf, gathering dust, while downstairs the photographs of Amber's mediocre performance in a middle school play would be framed and hung on the wall. That night I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, and felt something inside me go very quiet and very still. And I realised that I could win every prize and earn every honour and achieve every goal, and it would never be enough to make them proud of me the way they were proud of her. The realisation did not break me, which surprised me even then. Instead, it freed me in a strange way, because once you stop hoping for something, you stop being disappointed when it does not arrive. College should have been my escape, the place where I could finally build an identity separate from my family and prove myself on my own terms. But instead, it became 4 years of grinding survival that tested every limit I thought I had. My parents made it clear from the beginning that while they would pay for Amber's future education at whatever private university she chose to attend, I would be responsible for my own expenses, because I had always been so independent and capable. They said it like a compliment, Like my self-sufficiency was a gift they had given me rather than a necessity I had developed because they had never offered me anything else. I cobbled together financial aid and student loans and 3 part-time jobs that kept me working every moment I was not in class, and I learned what exhaustion really meant. The kind that settles into your bones and becomes part of your baseline existence. I worked the breakfast shift at a diner near campus from 5 in the morning until 9, serving coffee and eggs to hungover students and tired commuters. And then I went to my classes, smelling like grease and maple syrup, because I did not have time to go back to my apartment and shower. After my last class, I would go to my second job at the campus library, shelving books and helping freshmen figure out the Dewey Decimal System. And then at night, I worked as a tutor for wealthy students who paid me $20 an hour to help them pass classes that I was taking myself, while also working 60 hours a week. My apartment was a studio on the 4th floor of a building with no elevator, and it cost me more than half my income every month, despite being barely large enough to fit a bed and a desk and a microwave. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbours' conversations and arguments and intimate moments. And the radiator clanked all night in winter and did not work at all when I actually needed it. I ate ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches and whatever day-old pastries the diner let me take home at the end of my shift. And I learned to sleep in 4-hour increments because that was all the time I could afford to waste on something as indulgent as rest. Meanwhile, Amber's social media was a constant stream of sorority photos and spring break trips and restaurant meals that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. And sometimes, late at night when I was studying for an exam while fighting off exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning, I would scroll through her posts and feel something dark and bitter rising in my chest. She posted pictures of herself at football games and parties and formals, always perfectly dressed and perfectly happy, always surrounded by friends who had nothing better to do than take selfies and make memories. And the captions were always variations on the same theme, about how blessed she was, and how grateful she felt, and how amazing her life was turning out. During my sophomore year, I had a statistics professor named Dr. Ellen Reeves who changed everything, though I did not realise it at the time. She was in her 50s with grey hair she wore in a practical bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had a way of teaching that made even the driest material feel relevant and important. I had come to her office hours one afternoon to ask about a problem set, and we ended up talking for over an hour about applications of statistical modelling in business. And somewhere in that conversation, she asked me what I planned to do after graduation. I told her I was not sure, that I was majoring in mathematics because I was good at it, but I had no real plan beyond getting a degree and hopefully finding a job that would let me pay off my student loans before I turned 40. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses with an expression I could not quite read. And then she asked me if I had ever considered data analysis or business intelligence, fields where people who understood numbers could translate complex information into insights that companies would pay substantial money for. I admitted that I had never really thought about it, that honestly my plan had just been to survive college and hope something worked out afterward. And she nodded slowly like she had expected that answer and was disappointed but not surprised. Dr. Reeves told me that I was wasting my potential by not thinking strategically about my future, and she said it in a way that was direct without being cruel, like she was pointing out a simple fact that I should already know. She explained that companies across every industry were desperate for people who could make sense of data, that the ability to find patterns and draw actionable conclusions was becoming one of the most valuable skills in the modern economy, and that someone with my mathematical abilities and work ethic could build a career that would give me not just financial stability, but real power. She offered to connect me with some contacts she had in the business world, people who might be willing to mentor me or at least talk to me about career paths I had never considered. And I left her office that day feeling something I had not felt in years, which was hope mixed with possibility. I started taking every statistics and computer science course the university offered, teaching myself programming languages late at night after my tutoring shifts ended, building a skill set that felt like armor I was forging piece by piece. And then, in my junior year, Dr. Reeves called me into her office again and told me she had recommended me for an internship at a marketing analytics firm downtown, a position that would pay more than all three of my current jobs combined and give me real experience in a field that was just beginning to explode with opportunity. And I felt something crack open inside my chest. A door I had not even known was there, swinging wide to show me a future I had never imagined was possible. The internship at Caldwell Analytics changed the entire trajectory of my life in ways I could not have predicted. And from the first day I walked into their offices on the 20th floor of a downtown high-rise, I felt like I had discovered a language I had been trying to speak my whole life without knowing the words. The company specialized in helping businesses make sense of their customer data, translating millions of transactions and interactions into insights about behavior and preferences and patterns that could drive marketing decisions worth millions of dollars. My role was supposed to be basic, they told me during the interview, mostly cleaning and organizing datasets and running standard reports that the senior analysts were too busy to handle. But within 2 weeks, I had identified a flaw in their primary attribution model that was causing them to misallocate client budgets by nearly 15%. I brought it to my supervisor, a woman named Rachel Chen, who had been working in analytics for a decade, and I watched her face change as she reviewed my work, going from polite interest to genuine surprise to something that looked almost like respect. She took my findings to the director of analytics, and within a month, the entire company had restructured their methodology based on corrections I had suggested. And suddenly, people were asking me for input on projects that should have been far above my level as a college intern. I graduated with highest honours in mathematics, though my parents did not attend the ceremony because Amber had a sorority event that same weekend that my mother insisted was absolutely crucial for her social development and future networking opportunities. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma and my honours cords and the special recognition for outstanding achievement in my field. And I looked out at the sea of faces in the stadium and saw professors who had believed in me, and classmates who had studied alongside me, and Dr. Reeves sitting in the faculty section giving me a subtle thumbs up. But I did not see my family. After the ceremony, I went back to my tiny apartment and changed out of my graduation gown and went to work my evening shift at the library. And I felt nothing about their absence, which was somehow worse than feeling hurt or angry, because the numbness suggested that I had finally given up on expecting anything from them at all. Caldwell Analytics offered me a full-time position immediately after graduation, starting at a salary that seemed almost fictional compared to what I had been surviving on, and I accepted without hesitation and threw myself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I learned everything I could about data science and predictive modeling and machine learning, teaching myself new programming languages on weekends and staying late every night to work on projects that interested me. And within a year, I had been promoted twice and was leading a team of analysts who had been in the industry longer than I had been alive. The money started to change things in ways both practical and psychological. And suddenly I could afford to eat real meals and live in an apartment that did not have cockroaches and pay down my student loans faster than the interest could accumulate. I bought my first car. Nothing fancy, just a reliable used sedan that meant I no longer had to take the bus everywhere. And the first time I drove it, I thought about that morning at the bus stop in my graduation gown and felt a grim satisfaction that tasted like metal on my tongue. I started saving aggressively, putting away more than half of every paycheck into accounts that I monitored obsessively, building a financial cushion that grew thicker with each passing month. And I realised that what I was really building was insurance against ever being vulnerable the way I had been vulnerable my whole childhood. Money meant options, meant freedom, meant never having to depend on people who had made it clear I was not worth their time or resources. And I pursued it with a focus that some of my co-workers found unsettling. One of them, a guy named Marcus, who worked in the marketing department, asked me once why I worked so hard when I was already successful. Why I stayed late every night and came in on weekends and never seemed to take vacations. And I told him that I had things I needed to prove, though I did not specify to whom. My family reached out occasionally during this period, though their contact was sporadic and always seemed to coincide with moments when they needed something or wanted to share news about Amber's latest achievement. My mother would call every few months, usually on a Sunday afternoon when she was between church and whatever social engagement filled her calendar, and she would ask how I was doing, in that distracted voice that suggested she was mentally already moving on to the next task. I would tell her that work was going well, that I had been promoted again, that I was making decent money and building a good career, and she would make vague, encouraging sounds before pivoting to tell me about Amber's new boyfriend, or Amber's sorority position, or Amber's plans to study abroad for a semester in Italy on my parents' dime. The conversations followed a predictable pattern, with my mother talking for 20 minutes about Amber's life, and then wrapping up by saying she was glad I was doing okay, and that I should really try to visit home more often. As if I was the one who had created this distance between us. I would hang up the phone and feel that familiar hollowness, that sense of being a supporting character in someone else's narrative. And then I would go back to work and lose myself in data sets and algorithms that at least followed logical patterns I could understand and predict. During my third year at Caldwell, I noticed something that would eventually lead to the most important decision of my career, and it started with a simple observation about how inefficiently the company was handling its own internal processes. We were brilliant at analysing client data, I realised, but terrible at managing our own resources, with redundant systems and manual workflows that wasted hours of labour every single day. I started building tools in my spare time, small programs and automated processes that could streamline the work my team was doing. And what began as a way to make my own job easier gradually evolved into something more ambitious. I created a platform that could integrate data from multiple sources, clean and standardize it automatically, and generate insights with minimal human intervention. Essentially building a system that could do in minutes what currently took my team hours or sometimes days. I showed it to Rachel Chen, who by this point had become something of a mentor, and she looked at what I had built with an expression that was half amazement and half something that looked like concern. And she told me very quietly that what I had created was worth a lot more than a pat on the back from management. She suggested, carefully choosing her words like she was navigating a minefield, that I should consider whether this platform might have value beyond Caldwell Analytics, that companies across dozens of industries were struggling with the same problems I had solved, and that if I was willing to take the risk, I could potentially build something much bigger than a tool for internal use. The conversation planted a seed that grew roots quickly, and I started researching what it would take to start my own company, staying up late reading about venture capital and business incorporation and intellectual property law, teaching myself yet another new language, but this time one of entrepreneurship rather than code. The idea terrified me and thrilled me in equal measure, because starting a company meant risking the financial security I had worked so desperately hard to build. But it also meant the possibility of creating something that was entirely mine, something that my family could not dismiss or overlook or attribute to luck or good timing. I spent months developing the platform further, building it out into something robust enough to sell. And then I did something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I gave notice at Caldwell Analytics and used my savings to fund the first 6 months of what would become Bright Trail Digital. The early days of running my own company were a special kind of hell that combined all the worst parts of my college years with a layer of existential terror about whether I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. I worked out of my apartment, turning my living room into an office and my bedroom into a server room, and I spent 18-hour days writing code and building prototypes and cold calling potential clients who mostly did not return my messages. I burned through my savings faster than I had anticipated, watching the cushion I had built shrink week by week. And there were nights when I would lie awake doing calculations in my head about how long I could last before I would have to admit defeat and go crawling back to a traditional job. My family knew nothing about any of this, because I had stopped sharing details about my life with them after realizing that they would either not understand what I was trying to do, or worse, would understand and still not care. I did tell my mother once, during one of her sporadic phone calls, that I had left my job to start my own business, and there was a long pause before she asked if that was really wise, whether I should not just stick with something stable and reliable. And then she changed the subject to tell me about a nice young man from church who she thought might be good for me if I was interested in being set up. My first real client came in month 5, when I was down to my last $1,000 and seriously considering whether I needed to start applying for jobs again. And it was a mid-sized retail company that needed help understanding why their online sales were declining despite increased marketing spend. I threw everything I had into their project, analysing their data with a thoroughness that bordered on manic, and I found patterns they had missed, inefficiencies in their ad targeting and gaps in their customer journey that were costing them hundreds of thousands in lost revenue. My presentation to their executive team lasted 90 minutes, and by the end of it, their CEO was asking me how quickly I could implement my recommendations and whether I would be interested in a longer-term consulting arrangement. That first contract was worth $50,000, more money than I had ever seen from a single source, and when the payment cleared into my business account, I sat at my desk and cried for the first time in years. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing I was going to survive. And then, before the tears had even dried, I started thinking about what I needed to do next. Because one client was not enough. One success did not prove anything except that I had gotten lucky once. And I needed to build something bigger and more permanent than a single consulting contract if I was ever going to achieve what I had promised myself on that bus ride 5 years earlier. Bright Trail Digital grew faster than I had dared to hope, spreading through the business community like wildfire, fueled by word-of-mouth recommendations from clients who saw their revenues increase by double-digit percentages after implementing my systems. Within 2 years, I had hired a team of 12 people, moved into real office space with glass walls and standing desks, and a coffee machine that made better espresso than most cafes, and signed contracts with companies whose names I had once only seen on billboards and magazine covers. The platform I had built evolved into something more sophisticated with each iteration, incorporating artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms that could predict customer behavior with eerie accuracy. And suddenly I was fielding calls from venture capitalists who wanted to invest millions of dollars in exchange for equity in a company I had bootstrapped from my living room. I turned them all down because I had learned early that accepting money from people meant giving them power over your decisions, and I wanted Bright Trail to remain entirely mine, controlled by nobody except the person who had built it from nothing. By my 5th year in business, my company was generating 7 figures in annual revenue, and I had a client roster that read like a who's who of American retail and e-commerce. And I owned 100% of something that industry analysts were calling one of the most innovative data solutions platforms to emerge in the past decade. The money that came with this success was almost absurd in its abundance, more than I could spend even if I tried, and I found myself living with a strange disconnect between my bank account and my lifestyle. I still drove a modest car, still lived in a nice but not ostentatious apartment, still bought my groceries at the same store I had shopped at when I was surviving on ramen and peanut butter. My father would have called this poor asset allocation, a failure to properly signal my success through visible consumption. But I found that I did not care about the things that were supposed to represent wealth, the luxury cars and designer clothes and exclusive memberships. What I cared about, what kept me awake at night with a sick excitement churning in my stomach, was the thought of my family finally seeing what I had become, finally being forced to acknowledge that the daughter they had ignored was more successful than they had ever imagined possible. I fantasized about it constantly, imagining the moment when they would Google my name and find articles about my company, when they would drive past a billboard advertising Bright Trail services, when they would be at some social function and hear someone mention my name in connection with innovation and achievement. The fantasies were detailed and specific, and I returned to them like touching a sore tooth, pressing on the hurt to feel something sharp and real. The problem was that as my success grew, so did the hollowness inside me, expanding in direct proportion to my professional achievements until I felt like I was winning a game that no longer had any meaning. I would sit in my office overlooking the Nashville skyline, surrounded by evidence of everything I had accomplished, and feel nothing except a vague dissatisfaction that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. I had proven that I could build something valuable without my family's help or approval, had demonstrated that their neglect had not broken me the way it might have broken someone else. But the victory felt empty, because they did not even know there was a competition happening. My mother still called occasionally, with the same distracted tone in her voice, still spent most of the conversation talking about Amber, still had no real idea what I actually did for a living, beyond some vague notion that I worked with computers. My father had asked me once, during a brief phone conversation, if I was still doing that tech startup thing. And I had told him that yes, I was still doing that tech startup thing, and it was now worth several $1 million. And there was a long pause before he said, "That was nice," and changed the subject to ask if I knew that Amber had gotten engaged to a lawyer from a very good family. I started doing things that I knew were unhealthy, checking my family's social media accounts obsessively, even though I knew it would only make me angry. Tracking Amber's perfect life through carefully curated photographs and status updates that made everything look effortless and joyful. She had graduated from college with a communications degree that my parents had funded entirely, and she was working some entry-level marketing job that she treated like a temporary inconvenience before she settled into her real future as a society wife. Her engagement photos were professionally shot in a field of wildflowers, with her and her fiancé looking like models from a bridal magazine. And my mother had shared them with a caption about how blessed they were to be gaining such a wonderful son-in-law. I stared at those photos until my eyes hurt, and I felt something dark and bitter rising in my throat. And I thought about how easy it would be to destroy her happiness, how I could hire investigators to find dirt on her perfect fiancé, or use my resources to sabotage her little job, or simply show up at family events dripping in wealth and make everyone see how much more I had achieved. The thoughts scared me because they were so vivid and so tempting, and I realized that my quiet revenge was not so quiet anymore, that it was growing teeth and claws and threatening to become something monstrous if I did not find a way to redirect it. The turning point came on a random Tuesday afternoon when I was supposed to be reviewing quarterly financials, but instead found myself searching for my parents' address online, calculating how long it would take to drive there, and planning what I would say when I showed up unannounced to force them to see me. I sat at my desk with my hand on my mouse, cursor hovering over the search button, and suddenly felt a wave of disgust so powerful it made me physically ill. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, and asked myself what I was actually doing, what I thought I would gain from this endless cycle of achievement and resentment. I had spent years building a successful company, had created something genuinely valuable that helped other businesses thrive, had accumulated wealth beyond what most people ever dreamed of, and yet I was still that girl standing at the bus stop in her graduation gown, still waiting for my parents to notice I existed, still measuring my worth by their approval. The realization hit me like cold water, shocking and clarifying, and I understood with sudden, perfect clarity that as long as my success was defined by their reaction to it, I would never actually be free of them, would never actually win the game I was playing, because the rules were designed to keep me trapped in the same pattern forever. I thought about Dr. Reeves, who had seen potential in me when I could barely see it in myself. And I thought about Rachel Chen, who had encouraged me to take risks that changed my life. And I thought about all the clients whose businesses had grown because I had helped them understand their own data. These were people who had actually impacted my journey, who had contributed something real to who I had become. And I realized that none of them had done it to prove a point or settle a score. They had done it simply because they believed in helping others succeed. There was a framed photograph on my credenza, placed there almost as an afterthought months ago, and I picked it up and looked at it closely for the first time in weeks. It showed me with a woman named Jean Moreau standing in front of her bakery, covered in flour, and laughing with the unself-conscious joy of people who had just accomplished something difficult together. Jean had been one of my earliest clients, a woman who had taken out a second mortgage to start a small bakery and was failing miserably because she had no understanding of her customer demographics or buying patterns. And I had helped her restructure her entire business model based on data analysis that revealed who her real customers were and what they actually wanted. Her bakery was thriving now, with 3 locations and a wholesale contract with a regional grocery chain, and she sent me a card every year thanking me for saving her dream when she had been weeks away from bankruptcy. Looking at that photograph, I felt something shift inside my chest, a reorientation of purpose that was both supple and profound. And I understood that my quiet revenge could not be a single destructive act against my family, because that would accomplish nothing except making me as small and petty as they were. A true, lasting victory had to be creative rather than destructive, had to be about building something positive from the rubble of my own pain, had to ensure that my story, which had been a source of so much personal suffering, could become a source of strength and hope for someone else. I thought about the girl I used to be, standing at that bus stop feeling like the most invisible person on the planet. And I knew with absolute certainty that there were countless others just like her. Talented and brilliant and hard-working students who were navigating higher education without any familial safety net, working multiple jobs and skipping meals and fighting silent battles with self-doubt while being told that college should be the best time of their lives. These were people who understood what it meant to be overlooked and underestimated, who knew what it felt like to achieve something extraordinary and have nobody care, who were building their futures with nothing but determination and the stubborn refusal to give up. And suddenly I understood what I needed to do with the success I had built. The idea came to me fully formed, as if it had been waiting in the back of my mind for years, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. And I knew immediately that this was the answer I had been searching for, without knowing what the question was. I would create a foundation, a comprehensive support system for students who were achieving their dreams without or in spite of their families. Students who were the ultimate underdogs, fighting battles that nobody else could see. It would not just be a scholarship fund, because a check for tuition was helpful, but did not solve the deeper problems of isolation and lack of guidance, and the crushing weight of doing everything alone. My foundation would be different. It would provide full financial support for tuition and living expenses. But more importantly, it would create a community of mentors and peers who understood what these students were going through, who could offer guidance and encouragement, and the simple knowledge that they were not alone in their struggles. The name came to me as I stood at that window, watching the sun set over Nashville, turning the sky orange and purple and gold, and I spoke it out loud to the empty office, just to hear how it sounded. I would call it the Ride Forward Foundation, reclaiming the most painful symbol of my past and transforming it into a symbol of progress and hope. And for the first time in years, I felt something that was not anger or ambition or the hollow satisfaction of success. I felt purpose, clean and clear and real, burning in my chest like a flame that would warm instead of destroy. I threw myself into building the Ride Forward Foundation with the same intensity I had brought to Bright Trail Digital. But this time, the work felt different, fueled by something warmer than anger and more sustaining than ambition. I assembled a board of directors from people I trusted, lawyers and financial experts and educators who understood what I was trying to create. And I personally seeded the foundation's endowment with $10 million from my own accounts, watching that number disappear from my balance sheet and feeling lighter rather than diminished. We designed the scholarship program to be comprehensive and holistic, covering not just tuition and fees, but also providing stipends for housing and books and a small emergency fund, so that students would never have to drop out because their car broke down or they faced an unexpected medical bill. The most important component for me was the mentorship program, because I knew from experience that money alone was not enough. That what these students really needed was someone who believed in them and could guide them through the challenges that nobody else understood. Each scholarship recipient, we called them riders in honour of my bus journey, would be paired with a successful professional in their chosen field who would offer guidance and encouragement and serve as living proof that their dreams were achievable. The first round of applications was overwhelming in a way that simultaneously broke my heart and filled it to bursting, because we received thousands of essays from across the country, and each one was a story of resilience in the face of obstacles that should have been insurmountable. I insisted on being part of the selection committee, despite my staff suggesting that my time was too valuable for that kind of detail work, and I read every single essay myself, often late at night in my apartment, with tears streaming down my face, as I recognised my own pain reflected back at me in dozens of different voices. I read about a young man from the mountains of Appalachia who wanted to be the first in his family to graduate from college, but whose relatives saw his ambition as a betrayal of where he came from and refused to support him. I read about a young woman who had aged out of the foster care system at 18, with nothing but a garbage bag of belongings and a dream of becoming a social worker, so she could help kids like herself. I read about students working overnight shifts and sleeping in their cars and choosing between textbooks and groceries, all while maintaining the grades and test scores that proved they deserved a chance at something better. And then I read Emily Chen's application, and something in her words reached through the page and grabbed me by the throat, refusing to let go. Emily was from a small town in Tennessee, graduating at the top of her high school class with a passion for literature and a dream of becoming a teacher. And she wrote with devastating clarity about parents who loved her, but who fundamentally did not believe in her chosen path. They saw education as a practical necessity for getting a job, not as a calling or a passion worth pursuing. And they had made it clear that if she insisted on going to college to study something as impractical as English literature, she would be doing it entirely on her own. Her essay contained a line that made me stop breathing for a moment, a sentence that could have come directly from my own memory. And she wrote that her parents told her they would not attend her graduation unless she became successful enough by their standards, that their presence would be contingent on her proving she had made the right choice despite their warnings. The phrase "successful enough" hit me like a physical blow, because it crystallized everything I had felt growing up, that constant sense that no achievement was ever quite enough to earn the love and approval that should have been given freely. I sat at my desk holding Emily's application and cried for her and for myself and for every child who had ever been told that their dreams needed to be justified before they deserved support. And then I picked up the phone and called her myself, to tell her she had been awarded the first full Ride Forward scholarship. Emily answered on the third ring with a tentative hello that suggested she did not recognise the number and was half expecting a telemarketer. And when I told her who I was and why I was calling, there was a long silence, followed by a sound that was half sob and half gasp, a noise of such profound relief that it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. She could not speak at first, could only make these small, broken sounds, while I sat on my end of the line, feeling my own throat close up with emotion. And when she finally found words, all she could say was thank you, over and over, like a prayer or an incantation. I told her that we believed in her, that her dream of becoming a teacher was valid and important and worth supporting, that she was more than successful enough exactly as she was right now. And I heard her breath catch on that phrase like it had caught a hook in her chest. We talked for almost an hour about her plans for college and her fears about starting this journey, and her complicated feelings about her parents, who she loved despite everything. And by the time we hung up, I felt something I had not felt in years, which was a sense of connection to another human being, based not on what we could do for each other, but on a shared understanding of what it meant to be unseen. Emily Chen became the first rider in a program that would eventually help hundreds of students, But she also became something more important to me. She became proof that my pain could be transformed into someone else's possibility. A year later, we held our first Ride Forward Foundation gala at a hotel in downtown Nashville, and all of our inaugural riders were flown in from their various colleges to attend. Meeting them in person was an experience that recalibrated my understanding of what success actually meant, because these were not just statistics or application essays anymore. They were living, breathing people who had taken the support we offered and used it to build lives that would have been impossible otherwise. They stood in the hotel ballroom wearing clothes that ranged from thrift store formal wear to borrowed suits, and they talked with animation about their classes and their friendships and their dreams for the future. And every single one of them radiated a kind of determined hope that made my chest ache with a feeling I could not quite name. During the event, Emily, who had just completed her freshman year with a perfect 4.0 grade average, gave a speech that made every person in that room stop whatever they were doing to listen. She stood at the podium, looking poised and confident, in a way that seemed impossible for someone who had been so broken with relief just 12 months earlier. And she spoke about what the foundation had given her in a voice that was clear and strong and absolutely certain of every word. She said that the Ride Forward Scholarship had done more than pay her tuition, that it had given her a community of people who understood her struggles, that it had provided a mentor who answered her panicked late-night emails about whether she was smart enough to belong in college, that most importantly, it had given her the knowledge that she was not alone in feeling like an outsider in her own family. She said the scholarship had told her that her dream was valid, that her struggle was seen and acknowledged, that her journey mattered, not because of where she ended up, but because of the courage it took to begin it in the first place. I sat in the audience watching this incredible young woman who was flourishing in ways I had hoped for, but had not quite believed possible, and I felt something settle into place inside my chest. A sense of rightness that had nothing to do with my family or their approval, and everything to do with the simple act of using my pain to prevent someone else's. The hole in my heart that had been carved out by years of neglect was being filled, not with anger or wealth or recognition, but with the success and happiness of people I had helped. And I realized that this was what healing actually looked like, not the absence of scars, but the transformation of wounds into wisdom that could be shared. The foundation continued to grow over the following years, expanding its reach and helping more students with each application cycle. And Bright Trail Digital kept thriving in parallel, the two organizations feeding each other in ways that felt organic and right. My life became full in a way it had never been before, packed with work I loved and people I respected, and a sense of purpose that got me out of bed each morning with genuine enthusiasm rather than grim determination. The dull ache of my family's betrayal had faded to something quieter, a scar that I carried but no longer touched obsessively, and I found that I could go days or even weeks without thinking about them at all. When thoughts of my parents or Amber did surface, they came with less bitterness than before, replaced by a kind of distant sadness for what they were missing, for the person I had become that they would never really know. I had stopped checking their social media years ago, had stopped imagining confrontations or grand reveals, had stopped measuring my success against their capacity to acknowledge it, and the freedom that came with that detachment was sweeter than any revenge I could have engineered. Then one evening in early autumn, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number while I was working late at the Bright Trail offices, finishing up a presentation for a major client meeting scheduled for the next morning. I almost ignored it, assuming it was spam or a wrong number, but something made me open the message, and what I saw on the screen made my heart stutter in my chest. It was a photograph, slightly blurry and taken at dusk, showing one of our foundation's new billboards on the highway that led into Nashville from the south. The billboard was large and professionally designed, featuring a smiling photograph of our most recent scholarship recipient, alongside the foundation's tagline that read, "The journey forward starts here," in bold letters. And standing just to the side of the billboard, almost out of frame but clearly visible, was my mother. She was looking up at the sign with an expression I could not quite read from the photograph. Something that might have been surprise or pride or confusion or some combination of all three. And the image felt surreal, like a collision between two universes that were never supposed to touch. A second text came through a moment later from the same number, and it contained just 4 words that I had waited my entire life to hear. "We're proud of you, Daisy." I stared at those 4 words on my phone screen for a long time, watching the letters blur and refocus as my eyes tried to process what I was seeing. And I waited for the surge of emotion that should have accompanied this moment, the vindication or triumph or even anger that I had imagined feeling for so many years. But what came instead was something quieter and more complicated. A strange flatness that felt almost like disappointment. Not because they had finally said the words, but because the words themselves no longer carried the weight they once would have. I sat in my office with the phone in my hand and the presentation forgotten on my laptop screen. And I thought about the girl who had stood at that bus stop in her graduation gown, desperate for exactly this acknowledgement, willing to twist herself into whatever shape might finally make her visible to the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. That girl would have wept at receiving this text, would have called them immediately, would have driven to their house in the middle of the night just to hear them say it again out loud. But I was not that girl anymore, and the realization of how far I had travelled from her was both liberating and melancholy in equal measure. There was no apology in the message, no acknowledgement of the years of pain they had caused, no admission of guilt or request for forgiveness, just a simple statement of pride that felt somehow both too little and too late. I looked at the photograph again, at my mother standing beside the billboard that represented everything I had built from the hurt she had helped create. And I felt a complicated mix of emotions that I could not quite untangle. Part of me wanted to respond with a detailed list of every moment they had made me feel worthless, every achievement they had dismissed, every time they had chosen Amber over me without a second thought, to make them understand exactly what their neglect had cost and what it had taken for me to overcome it. Another part of me wanted to simply delete the message and pretend I had never received it, to maintain the distance I had worked so hard to establish and refuse to let them back into a life they had never bothered to be part of. But there was a third option, quieter than the others, that whispered that maybe the most powerful response was the simplest one. An acknowledgement that required no explanation or justification or emotional labour on my part. I typed out a reply, keeping it brief and honest, thanking them for the message and telling them that I had made it on my own. The words felt true as I wrote them, not bitter or accusatory, but simply factual, a statement of how things had actually been. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and then I set the phone face down on my desk and returned to the presentation I had been working on. And I found that I could focus on the slides and data without the text message pulling at my attention like an open wound. My success had not been in spite of my family's neglect, I realised. It had been because of my own determination and hard work, and refusal to let their indifference define my worth. They had not shaped me through their support. They had simply created the conditions under which I had to shape myself. And while I would never be grateful for the pain they had caused, I could acknowledge that the person I had become was someone I genuinely liked and respected. The validation I had spent my whole life seeking from them was something I had learned to give myself, and that was a kind of freedom that no amount of belated pride could diminish. Over the following weeks, my mother tried to reach out several more times, sending texts that became progressively longer and more detailed, trying to explain or perhaps justify the years of favoritism by framing it as some kind of misunderstanding or difference in parenting styles. She suggested we meet for coffee to talk things through, using phrases like clear the air and start fresh, as if our relationship was something that could be reset with a single conversation and good intentions. I did not respond to most of these messages, not out of anger, but simply because I did not know what there was to say. What conversation could bridge the gap between who they thought I was and who I had actually become. My father sent a single email, forwarded through my business address since he apparently did not have my personal contact information, and it was brief and awkward, congratulating me on my success and suggesting that we should have lunch sometime to discuss potential synergies between his real estate business and my foundation. I read it twice, looking for some indication of actual remorse or recognition of how he had treated me, but all I found was the same transactional approach he had always taken to relationships, measuring value in terms of what could be gained rather than what could be given. I did eventually agree to meet my mother, not because I thought it would heal anything, but because I was curious about what she wanted to say after all these years of silence. We met at a quiet cafe on a Tuesday afternoon, and when she walked in, I was struck by how much older she looked, with lines around her eyes that I did not remember, and grey roots showing beneath her carefully coloured hair. She hugged me awkwardly, holding on a beat too long, like she was trying to memorise the shape of someone she barely knew. And then we sat across from each other at a small table and went through the ritual of ordering coffee neither of us really wanted. She started talking almost immediately, filling the silence with words that tumbled out like she had been practicing this speech for weeks, telling me how she had always known I was special, how she had just wanted to make sure I could stand on my own 2 feet, how sometimes tough love looked like neglect, but was really just preparing me for independence. I let her talk, watching her face as she tried to rewrite history into something more palatable, and I realised that she genuinely believed what she was saying, that she had constructed a narrative where her favouritism toward Amber had been some kind of intentional strategy rather than simple preference. When she finally stopped talking and looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to agree or forgive or provide whatever absolution she was seeking, I took a slow sip of my coffee and chose my words carefully. I told her that I appreciated her reaching out, but that I did not need her to explain or justify the past, that I had made my peace with being the daughter they overlooked and had built a good life in spite of it. I said that the foundation I created was not about proving anything to them, but about helping students who were going through what I had gone through, that my success was not a weapon I was wielding against them, but simply the result of choosing to define myself by my own standards rather than theirs. She started to cry, quiet tears that left mascara tracks down her cheeks, and she said she was sorry, that she had made mistakes, that if she could do it over, she would do things differently. I believed that she meant it in the moment, but I also knew that meaning it and understanding it were 2 different things, and that she would probably never fully grasp how deeply her neglect had wounded me, or how hard I had worked to heal those wounds without any help from her. We finished our coffee and said goodbye, with promises to stay in touch that we both probably knew would fade into the same sporadic contact we had maintained for years. And as I drove away from the cafe, I felt lighter somehow, unburdened by the need to make her understand or acknowledge or change. The conversation had not given me closure in the dramatic way that people talk about in movies, with tearful reconciliations and promises of new beginnings, but it had given me something more valuable, which was the confirmation that I no longer needed anything from her at all. My worth was not contingent on her recognition. My success was not measured by her pride. My happiness was not dependent on her approval, and realizing that I had truly internalized these truths, rather than just telling myself I believed them, felt like stepping out of a prison I had not even realized I was still carrying with me. I drove back to my office and dove into work with renewed focus. And when Emily Chen called later that week to tell me she had just been accepted into a graduate program for education with a full scholarship, I felt more genuine joy from that 5-minute conversation than I had felt during the entire hour with my mother. The years that followed brought continued growth for both Bright Trail Digital and the Ride Forward Foundation, and I watched dozens and then hundreds of students achieve dreams that their families had dismissed or discouraged, and each success felt like a small act of resistance against the idea that love and support should be conditional. I hired several former riders to work at Bright Trail once they graduated, creating a pipeline of talent that brought fresh perspectives and fierce determination to everything we built. And the company culture became known in the industry for its emphasis on recognizing and developing people who might be overlooked elsewhere. My relationship with my family settled into a cordial but distant pattern, with occasional phone calls on holidays and brief text exchanges on birthdays. And I made peace with the fact that we would never be close in any meaningful way. Amber got married in an elaborate ceremony that I attended but did not participate in, sitting in the back row and leaving early to catch a flight to a conference. And when my mother asked why I could not stay for the reception, I simply said I had work commitments and let her interpret that however she wanted. I was not punishing them with my absence. I had genuinely built a life that was full enough that their events were not the central focus they once might have been. The final piece of peace came unexpectedly during a conversation with one of our riders named Marcus, who had been awarded a scholarship 3 years earlier and was now finishing his degree in social work. He came to the foundation offices to meet with me about possibly joining our mentorship program as a volunteer. And during our conversation, he said something that struck me with the force of a revelation. He told me that the most important thing the foundation had given him was not the money or even the mentorship, but the permission to stop trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it, to redirect that energy toward building relationships with people who actually saw and valued him. He said that growing up, he had thought something was wrong with him because his parents could not love him the way he needed. But the foundation had shown him that sometimes the problem is not with the child, but with the parents, and that recognizing that truth was not about blame, but about freedom. I sat across from this young man who was articulating something I had spent decades learning, and I felt tears prick my eyes because I realized that my own journey had created a map for others to follow, that my pain had been transformed into a pathway that made their journeys just a little bit easier. I never did get the dramatic confrontation or the public vindication that I had once fantasized about. There were no moments where my family fell to their knees begging forgiveness, or where I got to deliver a devastating speech about everything they had done wrong. What I got instead was something quieter and more lasting, which was the knowledge that I had taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and turned it into the best thing I ever did for others. The bus ride on my graduation day, that symbol of invisibility and neglect, had become the foundation for an organisation that made sure other students would never have to feel as alone as I had felt. My family's inability to love me properly had taught me how to love myself enough to build something meaningful. And while I would never be grateful for their neglect, I could acknowledge that it had shaped me into someone capable of profound empathy and fierce determination. Because sometimes the best revenge is not proving them wrong. It is not needing to prove anything at all. It is building a life so full and purposeful and joyful that their approval becomes irrelevant, a footnote in a story they were never really part of. And if you have ever been the overlooked one, if you have ever felt invisible in your own family, or measured your worth by someone else's standards, I want you to know that you are not alone, that your struggle is seen, and that the journey forward starts with the simple, radical act of deciding that you are already successful enough, exactly as you are right now.